Okay, good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. I'm Rachel Goldbrenner, the Executive Director of the Reiss Center on Law and Security. For those of you who don't know us, the Reiss Center is a nonpartisan and multidisciplinary research center based at NYU School of Law. We convene public and private dialogues, publish original research and analysis, and help to train the next generation of national security leaders. And today we're delighted to be bringing you this important discussion, the US elections on a global stage. We're convening today, of course, with just a week to go in the final countdown before November 5th. And I know that the impending elections are very consuming for many of us, including me. But so often media and popular attention is focused predominantly on the domestic aspects of the race, to the exclusion, perhaps, of considering how this very important election will affect people and institutions around the world, and in turn, how world events may impact our elections and US foreign policy in the future. So today we wanted to provide an opportunity to explore the extraordinary stakes and potential consequences of these elections from a more international perspective. And to help us do that, we're very fortunate to have a panel of diverse experts, thinkers, practitioners with us this afternoon. Despite their very long and impressive bios, which I commend to you, I'm going to introduce each speaker only briefly in order to leave as much time as possible for today's discussion. The discussion will be moderated by Michael Hanna, who's a non-resident senior fellow at the Reiss Center. Michael is also the US Program Director at the International Crisis Group, where he leads the organization's research, analysis, policy prescriptions, and advocacy on US foreign policy in conflict settings. Ambassador Dr. Bonnie Lin, is a senior fellow for Asian security and director of the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. From 2015 to 2018, she served in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where she was director for Taiwan and country director and senior advisor for China. Dr. Constanze Stelzenmüller is an expert on German, European, and transatlantic foreign and security policy and strategy. She's the director of the Center on the United States and Europe and the inaugural holder of the Fritz Stern Chair on Germany and Transatlantic Relations at the Brookings Institution. And Ambassador Martin Kimani is the executive director of the NYU Center for International Cooperation. Until earlier this year, he was the permanent representative of Kenya to the United Nations, where, among other roles, he served as president of the Security Council in October 2021 and of the UN Development Program in 2023. So as you can see, we have a really extraordinary group assembled, and I want to thank our speakers for being with us today to share your wisdom and perspectives at this very consequential moment. And with that, I will turn things over to Michael Hanna and our panel to begin.
Thanks so much for the introductions, and you've done the hard part, Rachel. And thanks for our guests for joining. I'm just going to jump right in so we have as much time for the discussion amongst us. This is a sort of a question to all of our panelists. Just wondering about general impressions about the role that foreign policy is playing. It is usually not the top line issue unless we see the United States really directly at war, but it is always there. It's a kind of litmus test for presidential plausibility, and of course, specific foreign policy issues do break through from time to time. And so I'm just I'd be interested in all of the panel's impressions about how foreign policy is playing out in the current campaign. And maybe, Constanze, maybe you can start us off, and then we can go to Ambassador Kimani and Bonnie this first round.
Well, how do I put this succinctly? It's no longer original, but I think still correct to say that this is an everything, everywhere, all at once kind of election, right? Where not only all the what we used to think of as very distinct foreign and security policy theaters are blending into each other, most notably the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic. But I think we can easily extend that to others, including Africa. And also the domestic and foreign policy and economic policy are now firmly interlinked, right? So we foreign policy people who, of course, think of ourselves as the cavalry of international relations, and of election analysis, have had to start thinking very hard about the domestic policies on offer and what that means for the bandwidth and the options of foreign policy makers domestically within national context and also in alliances and in international collaboration. I'll leave it at that, but that is a quite significant shift for what used to be a priesthood that didn't think it was, accountable to anybody, or didn't have to talk to economists or to domestic policy people.
Ambassador Kimani?
Thank you, Michael. It's really great to be here. Hi, Constance, and hi, Bonnie.
Good to see you.
Yeah. Look, the foreign policy aspect of the race that I have been following just leaves me with the impression that these are two vastly different approaches to foreign policy. Kamala Harris is very much in keeping with where Biden has been and generally represents what I would call a broad consensus in Washington. And Trump doesn't. Trump is, file by file, they could have similarities, but broadly speaking, Trump is more disruptive to US foreign policy sort of traditions of the last 20 years. His main promise seems to be less initiation of war by Washington, a greater willingness to negotiate and to push parties to negotiate. And I know that does not meet the favor of a lot of people in Washington, but Trump certainly represents disruption, as he did when he was pushing NATO members to up their contributions to NATO and even seeming to imperil Article 5. But when it comes to Israel, when it comes to Ukraine, these are where I think their differences will count the most in the coming year, whoever wins.
And I would very much echo what Ambassador Kimani mentioned in terms of we're seeing some similarities between the two candidates, at least on policy towards China and the Indo-Pacific. But I would say probably more differences than similarities. I would also note in terms of understanding how foreign policy plays in the election, I think, as you correctly mentioned, Michael, we don't see foreign policy being central to any of their platforms, but we do see that when they are talking about foreign policy issues, at least when it comes to China and Indo-Pacific, there is a bit of a competition to showcase who is harder on China, who is more, in some cases, more pro allies and partners. And what's been interesting for me to follow is how, in the cases in which foreign policy has broken through and has been central to each of their campaigns, we've seen very small snippets of what each candidate has said. And actually, if you take what they said, for both cases, it's largely out of context, right? So for President Trump, for example, when he talks about Taiwan and how the United States would respond to a potential Chinese blockade of Taiwan, he's talking about imposing economic tariffs on China. That could be a potential action that the United States could do, but there's a lot more that his team will probably come up with and add to that. And then for Vice President Harris, for example, when she's talking about Taiwan and she mentions that she doesn't want to go into hypotheticals, then there are other folks taking that out of context and saying, oh, because she doesn't want to talk about hypotheticals, that differs from President Biden because he mentioned that the United States would defend Taiwan, right? So these smaller injects of foreign policy are being interpreted a lot of different ways, whereas if we had each candidate be really flesh out their foreign policy, it would probably be a little bit more well-rounded than how either are presented at times.
The campaign is maybe not the best platform for really elucidating policy lines. Probably goes for domestic policy as well. So my second question to everybody is something of a new issue, unfortunately, but it is the question of how American democracy proceeds. It's not something that I think many Americans had thought about previously, but there has been instances of democratic backsliding. And in the last electoral cycle, we saw outright political violence in a way that I think shocked many Americans and I think many foreign observers. Of course, there is interplay there between America's own democratic health and its purported global leadership. And so I wonder how maybe people have become accustomed to this at this point, but we face many of these same pressures again. And I wonder how perceptions of the health of American democracy are playing out and affecting perhaps global confidence in the future of American leadership. Whoever wants to jump in first.
Yeah, I think I can take that on first. One, because I'm an African who has seen my share of post-election violence and the uncomfortable peaceful transfer of power. I was just talking to a friend earlier today who had been driving around the battleground states. And to put it simply, this is an election of negativity. Each side sees stopping the other side as almost an existential need. And because the stakes are being expressed in that way, the extreme political reactions come with that kind of expression of an existential contest. So I would not be surprised if there were acts of political violence. And after all, there have been 2 assassination attempts on Donald Trump, and I have been shocked at how little I've seen them covered in the media. I mean, I would have expected them to get a lot more coverage, but they haven't. And I think that, again, just speaks to the kind of division there is in the United States today. Look, when we have this kind of situation, whether it's in Kenya or in other countries, what usually happens is there is a middle path that is defined by the private sector, by prominent citizens who come out to try and hold the center. I do not see that center existing in the United States. I do not see the private sector playing that role. It seems very divided. And so the progress between November 5th and January, I think, is fraught with risks. I suspect that unless there's such a clear outright winner, we're going to have a sort of full of lawsuits and uncertainty about the outcome. And that will encourage extreme elements to use that time to try and make political spectacles that could include violence.
Yeah, if I could jump in, I think even before our election, this election, we had already started seeing a number of narratives that China and Russia have put out of the United States, right? That we do not have a healthy democracy, that we should not be defining what a democracy is. And if you read Chinese propaganda, you'll see that they constantly emphasize the violence within the United States, and they constantly emphasize how it's not safe, even for Chinese in the United States or anyone in the United States. A lot of amplification of the worst elements that they're seeing within US society now. And that narrative isn't just because China has issues with the United States. It's a narrative that China is propagating against our allies and partners, to parts of the global South and elsewhere, to basically portray the United States as not fit to lead anymore, right? Our system is corrupt, it's bankrupt. Why is the United States setting the rules of the international order? Why is the United States setting the notion that democracies are the more respective political systems within the international order, when as a democracy ourselves, we have so many problems? That's a narrative that we're seeing China and Russia amplify more and more. I would also say so that's one side. The other side I would mention is, I think it's important to remember that when we have more domestic uncertainty within the United States, that could also lead to some of our counterparts being more uncertain about what exactly is happening within the United States, which reminds me of an actually quite unfortunate time in the end of the prior Trump administration in late 2020 and early 2021, where you had then Chief of the Joint Staff, the Chairman of the Joint Staff, General Milley, calling his Chinese counterparts, not because the United States was actually going to do anything. But because the Chinese had seen all the domestic issues that we were having, the increased anti-China rhetoric, and were worried that we were going to attack China. So General Milley had to call his Chinese counterpart to assure China that we were not going to attack China. But that just speaks to, like, when there's more uncertainty within the United States, a little bit more political chaos, it leads to all types of assumptions and lack of understanding what's going on, and that impacts how countries think about the United States, and it also allows other countries to amplify negative narratives of the United States.
Right. I was just thinking what I could contribute here. I'm a lawyer by training, and I've been spending a fair amount of time in the past 8 years looking at the American hard right and the European hard right. And I think while it is definitely reasonable to have a concern about the possibility of social violence, right, and attempts to influence politics on the streets, I think it's also important to see that the American hard right, which currently has air superiority over the GOP, is bent on something slightly different than it was 8 years ago or 4 years ago, and which is what a book by Patrick Deneen, one of their philosophers, calls regime change, and by which is meant changing the constitutional order on the Hungarian model. Sorry, there's a helicopter flying over me. I don't know whether you can hear that, but it always sounds very loud when it happens, because we're in the middle of town. And that is really something quite extraordinary. It's not as though in American constitutional history there had never been sort of identitarian, anti-representative democracy tendencies. In fact, arguably, that is what the very first manifestations of democracy in America looked like, the Puritan town meetings, which were essentially totalitarian, right? But for ever since then, in the double helix of American democratic thinking, that tendency has been minoritarian. And this is the first time that it has achieved domination over one of the main political parties, and that it is setting out its goals so forthrightly and so and with so little dissimulation. And I think that to me is what's special about this moment. And should you be wondering now, is this being seen as an enabler or as an encouragement by European hard right movements? Of course it is, right? I just want to say one other thing about, and then I'll shut up, about this social violence point. And I sometimes think, you know, the Washington Post has had this motto, democracy dies in darkness. And I think one of the ways in which democracy could also be endangered here is not by sort of, as it were, social coercion on the streets, but by the sort of functional elites of the civil service and of politics looking at this scenario and saying, I did this, I've been through this 8 years ago, and I stood it out. I hung in there for 4 years, and I don't think I can do this again. And either not running again, as in the case for a historically high number of members of both the Senate and the Congress, or in the case of the courts or the executive agencies, taking early retirement or going into private practice. I think we may see a great deal of that as well. And finally, one point that I want to mention, because it's been referenced obliquely, is something that my wonderful colleague Fiona Hill just did a Q&A in Politico about, which is the quite striking role of the oligarchs, American oligarchs, in this election, right? And the way that they are determining the ambit of free speech. And Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Mr. Sung, the owner of the LA Times, the owners of USA Today, all of them refusing to take a stance to make a recommendation, which has been practice of newspapers for the past 50 years at least. And there I think you're also seeing either sort of reactionary politics on the part of the oligarchs, or a sort of retreat into political privatization, or rather quietism. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
If I could just come in, Michael, you know, through the years, I've listened to my share of lectures from American diplomats on the state of Kenyan democracy. And I've always thought that their understanding of democracy was so tepid that they thought of it as a series of processes that peacefully and inevitably lead to sort of continuity. Divisive politics, pitched politics is dangerous. So I'm not saying that that the violence is acceptable, and I'm not supporting it. But when you have division and a sense of real stakes and a sense of an establishment that is divided, the elite is divided, there's no longer a consensus about how America should be governed and how America should act on the world stage, then it gets dangerous. And so I don't even think we should call it social violence. We should call it political violence. That's what it is. That's what two assassination attempts on a presidential candidate mean. If America were an African country now, we would be having deputations of senior politicians. The State Department would be sending officials over, and there'd be statements of concern telling us that everyone needs to calm down. But because of the role the United States
Martin, nobody
plays,
is stopping you from doing that.
I'm doing it now. I'm doing it now. But look, the reason this election is so important is because, to me, for the first time, the smooth consensus between Republicans and Democrats has disappeared. There was a time when you could barely tell the difference between a Bush Republican and a Clinton Democrat. So yes, they had a few technical differences between them, but basically they saw the world the same. This is no longer the case, and that's why it's now become a lot more politically dangerous. And this is real democracy. Democracy, I think, is quite a dangerous exercise, not all the time, but when certain energies build up for a generation.
Well, at the risk of abusing my moderator's chair, I would just note that Crisis Group just put out a primer on the possibilities of political violence in and around or connected to this electoral cycle. So on this topic, but on this question, I mean, on the theme of unpredictability, I'll sort of continue it with a question about Donald Trump. Because obviously he's, I think, a singular force in U.S. politics, and injects an air of unpredictability that is new, I think, to American governance and to U.S. foreign policy, through his impulsiveness, through his contradictory positions, I think through the lack of a consistent worldview. And that's obviously something of a conundrum for other countries reliant on U.S. security or otherwise, keen to see the future direction of the United States. How does the rest of the world prepare for that unpredictability, or is that simply not something that others can do ahead of time? Whoever wants to jump in first.
Michael, maybe before we jump in, could you share a little bit about how the level of political violence that your report is assessing? Because I think that would be quite interesting to all those who are watching.
Sure, I can do that. Well, I think there are reasons for some optimism around, I think, increased vigilance. I think there are real legal reforms that make some of the flashpoints around the efforts to overturn the previous election in 2020 less viable. It makes it much harder. And so those reforms, I think, will be quite important. It doesn't address those reforms can't address the political crisis. So if the legal side of the ledger looks improved, the political side does not, as we have been talking about. Ambassador Kimani mentioned the kind of existential stakes that pitches politics in a certain direction. And of course, we've seen already ahead of time the widespread efforts to sow doubt about the integrity of the election that many people worry is going to be the predicate for some kind of replay of what happened in 2020 if Trump were to lose. There's no legal mechanism by which to stop people from instigating in that fashion. And so even if I think legal landscape looks better and actually being effective in carrying out a coup, right, overturning an election is a much harder task legally, the very real possibility of people creating flashpoints for violence, I think, exists. And of course, I as well have been shocked by how little traction the assassination attempts have really gotten. You know, they were blips on the screen in what was a very, I think, tumultuous summer. I think, you know, yes, we continue to be concerned, you know, it's a country with a lot of guns, and that has to be part of the discussion. And so that you know, enables, I think, individuals who are bent on causing chaos. It enables them to do so. So yes, still very concerned. And Sansa, you want to jump in?
Well, I just wanted to point out that the opposite is also true, which is that 2 assassination attempts against 1 candidate, that's absolutely extraordinary, that's unprecedented. And it has actually not led into a significant bump in sympathy for Trump. And that's as odd as the other aspects, right? I mean, there's many things about this election that are sort of, to use a well-trodden term, weird, right? But that is one of them. But since may I try and answer your question about the preparing for
Please.
Unpredictability? Yeah. I mean, I am in conversation with Europeans and Americans about Europe all the time, as you would imagine, since I run the Center on the US and Europe here. And in fact, I just came from one. And I think there's really 2 ways that you can think about this. You can, and I think the more modern way to think about this is that unpredictability and increasing disruptions are the political and the non-political future of the world that we live in, right? That's what I meant earlier by the everything, everywhere, all at once sort of scenario, right? Globalization, whether we like it or not, whether we disapprove of it or not, or whether we believe it in or not, right, means that the causalities are no longer linear, right? And that things that can happen very far away can have quite an immediate impact on us. So regardless of the US elections, we have moved into a geostrategic environment of permanent disruption. And arguably, if I'm a European doing grand strategy, or for that matter, an American, I need to say that is the future against which I need to prepare, right? And the reason I included American in there is that superpowerdom and nuclear weapons don't really get you very far in that kind of scenario, right? What gets you far is your ability to play well with others, right? What also gets you farther is your ability to as a nation state provide public goods effectively, credibly, and legitimately, right? So again, if I were a politician or if I were doing grand strategy, I would say I would look to my own ability to provide decent governance to my citizens and to the other people who live in my country, and to my ability to be a good ally, right, and work well with others, because that's the only way that we're going to get through this together, right? And I frankly see deficiencies in Europe, since I'm a European, on all those counts. And I also see, of course, the hard right in Europe very deliberately picking at the ability of mainstream politics to provide legitimate and effective governance, right? The whole idea is to increase the disruption in order to as it were, accelerate the transformation that they desire. Whether the transformation they're thinking about, I personally think that the thinking of the hard right is really quite shallow about these things, and often, internally contradictory, inconsistent, etc. But in other words, whether that will work out that well for them is, I think, a real question. I tend to think that revolutions are eaten by their children, and that the radicals of today will be eaten by the radicals of tomorrow. But that is where we are, and it really is. And it turns out that even for sort of sophisticated, large, prosperous, democracies in Europe, including mine, right, that has suddenly become a much larger challenge than we had ever thought possible, and it is puncturing our complacency in a very big way.
I don't know if anybody else has thoughts to add.
Sure, happy to add on to that. I think what we're seeing in DC in terms of foreign partners being trying to understand the situation is, I would say, a lot more perhaps private anxiety that they don't show up publicly, and trying to reach out to all the different types of actors that are in the potential Trump camp. Because as we've talked about, I think there's perhaps less coherence among the Trump camp and a wider variety of views. So we're seeing a lot of our foreign counterparts reaching out and trying to understand the whole range of views out there, and recognizing that they can't quite understand where President Trump might be, but understanding at least a whole range will help them prepare a bit more. And I think the desire to understand what's going on in DC is partially probably behind what we're seeing in terms of the Chinese hacking into the phone calls that we're seeing of the Trump family as well as the Bidens, because they're recognizing the how consequential this election could be, and also how different some of the positions are. I would also say that privately, I feel like I hear a lot of our foreign counterparts privately voice concern about the greater disruption that President Trump might bring about, but you won't see any of them saying it publicly or officially. But what's interesting to note is once you dig through public opinion polls or subnational polling, then you start to see some of these concerns float up. So for example, the Taiwan government has been very great in saying how wonderful President Trump has been during his first administration in strengthening relations with Taiwan, right? But if you look at public polls in Taiwan, a poll that came out this July and August, 46% of the Taiwan public prefer Vice President Harris, compared to only 15% that prefer Trump, and 39% say they're undecided. And similarly, we know during the first Trump administration, under the leadership of Prime Minister Abe, Japan had one of the strongest relationships with the United States. But polls of Japanese firms, also around the same time frame, show that 46% believe either candidate's fine, but 43% prefer Harris over Trump for business. So beneath all of the very diplomatic language that is being flown around DC, in which no country wants to potentially upset President Trump if he were to come back into office, there's a lot of anxiety underneath that, both within the general populations and our foreign counterparts, but also within the political elites as well as the business community.
I think this is such a fascinating time to be a diplomat. For most of my life, your chief diplomat you've sent to Washington, that's been the most important relationship between your country and any other country. And I think that will continue for some time to come, but it's no longer the only game in town. There are more players in the field, and not just China versus America. There are regional powers, there are middle powers who are all flexing their muscles and having to maneuver differently, because you can no longer rely on Washington's attention and bandwidth. Groups of countries are coming together around single themes, around single campaigns. And these are not alliances necessarily. These are groupings of convenience, groupings of coalitions of the willing to push on particular issues. So you're having to put together a lot more groups as a country and join a lot more groups to get things done. And I think that's going to continue into the future. And in terms of the two candidates, even though President Trump appears to be the more disruptive of them, even the continuity of American foreign policy as it has been in a world that has changed so much creates its own deep uncertainties. So continuity or disruption, what will come out of Washington will not find a world that is settled as it has been. And so there's going to be, I think, like Constance said, just a new age of uncertainty.
You mentioned attention and bandwidth, and I'll stick with you for another question, because we've seen a kind of belated, maybe some would say half-hearted, diplomatic push led by the U.S. on Sudan, a war that really, is the biggest source of displacement and famine in the world at the moment, but eclipsed by first Ukraine and Gaza. There has been, I think, a sense throughout the continent, throughout Africa, that there has been less attention and a kind of neglect. And of course, you mentioned the middle powers and other options. And of course, it's refracted through the lens of great power competition at times in Washington. But I wonder, in that kind of messy picture, what is it that Africa is hoping to see from, regardless of who the winner is, but what is it that Africa is hoping to see? I often hear people say that, the United States isn't present, they're not there. And I wonder, what is it that perhaps African countries might be looking for to see more of from the United States?
Thank you, Mike. That's the toughest question of the whole conversation we've had. Look, Sudan, no matter who's president, is a tough assignment. And I don't want to sound pedantic, but just to bring you back to how this started. It started by young Sudanese rising up to fight for civilian government, for democratic civilian government. So the lack of bandwidth in responding to them is what then led to the military and the generals fighting for power. So the lack of bandwidth did not start now. It's been going on for some years, and it's not just the United States. It's even Kenya and the region. How to take advantage of the moment when young people are fighting for liberty and for better economic prospects. So I think what is happening with Sudan, it may happen in many African countries. This huge surge of young populations, of ambitious and impatient young people being governed by ineffective states with broken social contracts. It may not get to the kind of catastrophe of Sudan, but the bandwidth that's needed from Washington is not just the immediate emergency in Sudan, but is rather, how do you re-engage different African countries, understanding that this youth population is not going to stand by and be robbed and misgoverned without causing intense disruption that then can easily turn to violence. So I think that bandwidth is really required, and I don't think it's there. But on Sudan specifically, I think the United States has enough assets, enough relationships to make a real difference in the protection of civilians in Sudan, making sure those young people's hopes are met, making sure that the warring parties are brought to the table with a lot more leverage. So I don't know which of the two candidates is going to do that, but the continued ignoring of Sudan reflects really badly on the United States and the United States' posture as the indispensable country. In Sudan, the United States is not behaving like the indispensable country. And I really hope that one of their advisors is listening to this conversation, because they will be judged in Africa to the extent to which they respond to this catastrophe.
So I have a point that's also, I guess, a question for Martin, which is that as somebody, when I was still a journalist quite a while ago, started out her career reporting about African events, not least the Rwandan genocide. It seems to me that we're looking really at a quite wholesale failure of Western, both American and European approaches to helping Africans develop, as it were, independent, prosperous, sovereign, status in the world. And we are now seeing the Russians and the Chinese move into the vacuum left thereby. And I'm not saying that African politics is a vacuum. What I'm saying is that as the sort of Western players retreat in confusion and disarray, that it has clearly left opportunities for the Chinese and for the Russians, which strike me as, I mean, whatever you may think of the sort of denial and complacency and self-congratulatory nature, right, or double standards of Western policies, it seems to me that what the Russians and the Chinese are doing is in many ways rather more nefarious, right? And I'd be really curious to hear sort of what your take, Martin, is on this, and what sort of Western countries should be doing to sort of help you work through that, if that is indeed even desired.
Yeah, well, thanks. Look, when President Uhuru Kenyatta came to Washington and met President Trump, the first question President Trump asked him is, why aren't you doing business with American companies? And President Kenyatta said, well, you're a businessman, and as you know, you can't cut deals with people who are not doing business with you. And China is here, we're doing business with them. China is not in Africa for nefarious reasons. China had a strategy, they engaged on that strategy. It's a trade and investment strategy. It's led by state-owned enterprises, a lot of filling of the infrastructure gap that's there. And African countries, by and large, are very glad for it. And what it has lacked is an American offer, an American deal by American companies. So, Constance, I think, let me pick your question because you use the word help. And that right there is where it all falls apart. The reason I'm okay.
You realize I self-corrected, right?
Okay, good. But it's not you I'm criticizing. I'm just taking advantage of your question. When you look at the demographic collapse of the wealthiest countries in the world, especially European countries, and understand the profound economic impact of that, and then you look on the other hand and see this amazing demographic surge in Africa, you realize that if you're doing grand strategy like you talked about, you would understand that Africa is not there to be helped, but may become profoundly important in economic terms, with the right capital, with the right peace building and all the other investments we know. But that message, there are no leading politicians in the West today who have a real vision for that. And that's because their vision overall, not just with Africa, has narrowed, has become so much more short-term. Now, in terms of the two candidates we're talking about, when President Trump came on, he made the sort of African countries a shithole country, sorry to use the word. And there was great outrage about it. And his people, very realistically, I thought, knew immediately they don't have the bandwidth for the whole continent. So they picked a few countries and wanted to really drive the relationship much more strongly. With Kenya, they tried to drive a free trade agreement, which was going to be the first free trade agreement with an African country outside of Morocco, and I think Tunisia. And we went at it. And before they got out of office, they warned us. They said, if you don't quickly accelerate the signing of this agreement, the Democrats are going to pull it off the table. And that's exactly what the Biden administration did. And so what was that? This terrible comment, and then this entirely disruptive and paradigm-changing deal on the table. That was Trump's administration. Now, with Vice President Harris, she's been to Africa several times. Biden has tried to start a new strategy. So I think right now, Harris appears to be the one who'll be more active in Africa, but active, I think, in far more traditional ways. It's Trump who possibly could be disruptive. And the truth is, the relationship between the United States and Africa needs to be disrupted positively. It could also be disrupted quite negatively.
In light of time, we have to shift all the way across the world quickly. But Bonnie, I was going to turn to you to talk about strategic competition between the United States and China, which everybody has seemed to align on as the kind of overarching priority for the United States. The kind of past thoughts about engagement have been set aside, and yet there maybe isn't a consensus about how to do it. And of course, we see some sharp divisions, I think, between these two candidates and their team of advisors on this question. And so, one, I wonder, do you think there really is a kind of emerging consensus about strategic competition? Or does that really not tell us a whole lot about what that could look like? And maybe just briefly, your sketch of where you see the biggest differences potentially being between these two candidates and their teams.
Sure. Thank you, Michael, for the question. I do think that there is a broad consensus that that the United States needs to compete more with China. But I think that's where the difference beyond that, that's where you see a lot more of difference between the two candidates. So under President Trump, and again, this is a lot based off of his first administration, but also some of his comments during the campaign, there's probably going to be a particular intensification on the economic trade and technology side, right? He's talked about tariffs almost every time he's mentioned China or Taiwan, right? So, that's top of mind. He's also even talked about tariffs when talking about the potential for a military crisis or contingency. So it remains to be seen how much he wants to use that tool to shape the competition. But I think it would be safe to say that that will probably be top of the list in terms of how the Trump administration thinks about shifting the competition. We also have a wide cast of potential Trump advisors, those in the Trump circles. So of course, you have some within the Trump circle, large Trump circle, that are more that very much advocate for maintaining and deepening some of our alliances and relationships. On the other hand, you have more of the isolationist wing in this, and I don't really know which side will have more of a say. But if you use the practice from his first administration of the allies and partners that Trump sought to have relationships with, there was a lot of what can the ally and partner bring to the table, right? A lot more asking of the ally and partner to do more, a lot of emphasis on both our NATO allies as well as allies in the Indo-Pacific to do more in terms of defense spending. So I think there will be, as China looks at our election, I think they are wondering, is it possible under President Trump that the United States could have weakened relationships with allies and partners across the board? And I think they're wondering that right now, but they'll need to see what actually happens. The other thing I'll point out in terms of a difference between the Harris and the Trump administration, with Harris, at least from what we're seeing so far, largely broadcasting a view that's very much consistent with the Biden administration's policies, is that if you recall, one of the things that the Biden administration tried to get rid of was the China initiative. So a lot of the domestic focus within the United States on how do you deal with Chinese students, Chinese researchers, Chinese nationals within the United States. We're, of course, seeing that coming back. And I would imagine under the Trump administration, there would be much more scrutiny on Chinese nationals, Chinese students within the United States, perhaps a resurgence of a lot of the efforts that were already underway during the first Trump administration. I would also note that Taiwan still remains an area of uncertainty with respect to where President Trump is and Vice President Harris is. Obviously, the little snippets that I was talking about earlier showcase some of the differences. But if you look beyond President Trump and look at his advisors, most of his advisors support a very strong relationship with Taiwan. And if you look at the cast of characters that are currently in the Biden administration that could be supporting Harris administration, I think most also support a very strong relationship with Taiwan. So I think those are some of the I guess, some of the differences, but also some of the areas where I think some of the reporting may suggest more differences, but in reality, we might see more continuity.
Well,
Yeah.
but on its, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to comment. I suddenly had this image of an American umbrella in this huge storm that's going on, and huddled inside the American umbrella are the Europeans, who don't dare come out from the umbrella because they don't want to take a drenching. And I suspect, actually, and sorry, maybe I'm misdirecting us, that the middle powers, some of the countries in the Gulf, in Asia, are going to play a greater and greater role as bridgers between the United States and China, between the United States and other countries, where they on specific issues. So if I was to be a diplomat right now, I would like to be a Gulf diplomat, or a diplomat in Asia, with a country that is not under the umbrella, but has enough breadth and leverage within its region to be far more indispensable than it has been. So whoever the advisors are of these two candidates, they're going to find the world far harder to manage if they think of themselves as managing it. They're going to need to do a lot more with others. I think the Europeans are going to be, sorry, and Constance, I don't know if this is going to sound bad. I think the Europeans are just under the umbrella. They're just going to stay there. They're huddled. They can't do anything. So it's an interesting time. The United States, whether Trump or Harris, are going to have to work much more closely with the Egypts and the UAEs of the world than they have in the past.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. We're going to turn to Europe now. I think just the one note on that is that one of the things that I think the United States is working out, or trying to work out, and hasn't done so yet for itself, is what it expects of its partners, particularly the middle powers, and what are red lines in those relationships in terms of strategic competition, and what are the things where a multiplicity of interests and differences in terms of how you pursue them don't seem to upset the bilateral relationship in the United States. And so we've seen a little bit of this with the Gulf in particular, but trying to draw parameters around those relationships in a way that doesn't expect a kind of zero-sum approach to competition, but figures out for itself what are the things that really matter. And I think that's a work in progress. But I do think you're right, Ambassador Kimani, that we do see these kinds of attempts, at least, at bridging some divides, although I think they still face some big capacity issues. But shifting to those under the umbrella, I think there are questions about that umbrella, I guess, very much at the in terms of the debate between these candidates. And Trump, of course, has talked very hyperbolically about settling Ukraine in 24 hours. His vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance, has spoken in very sharp ways about both the war effort, and about the future of NATO and burden sharing. And I, of course, wonder if they do come to office, what that would look like in terms of its first contacts with reality. But what is the expectation for what comes next, particularly since there is, I think, some growing pessimism about the war. It seems like an open-ended war of attrition that Russia is very happy to fight, and there might be, I think, a moment of reassessment, even if it is a Harris administration. And so I just wonder your sense of where this is going, and whether this really does represent the kind of sharp divergence between the candidates that it at least appears to be rhetorically at the moment.
That was a lot of questions, and we've got about 4 minutes, and I presume the others would like to pitch in as well. Look, I'm going to be I'll try and be as succinct as I can. I am willing to bash Europeans with the best of them, and I can do so in great detail, and I can particularly do that for my own country, Germany. I can do that until you're all blue in the face and it's dark outside. But I will also say that Europe is sometimes deceptively weak, right? And that the truth is that it actually has power assets and sources of strength that are perhaps not immediately visible to people because they don't take the form of nuclear weapons. I'm deeply concerned right now about the future of Ukraine. I'm deeply concerned about the status of our support for it. And I'm concerned about Russia's gains. But I've just made that point in a column in the FT, so it's no use denying it. But I will also say that Russia is paying a horrific price for very small gains, and that I don't think it can be particularly assuring for the Chinese to see the North Koreans disembarking in Russia and making their way to the Ukrainian front. I do not think that that is a net positive for China at all, right? I also have sincere doubts, Martin, about the middle powers in the world, some of whom I think are inflating their options, their bandwidth, their possibilities, rather more than I find convincing, right? And who themselves are hampered by economic issues, by democratic concerns, by political factionalism, polarization, and so on. India is a case in point, right? India, where my great-grandfather lived for 30 years, and my father was posted as a diplomat, so I have a sort of, you know, an acquaintance with it, is currently trying to turn its non-Hindu citizens into second-class citizens. That kind of thing, we've seen that movie, and it never goes well. I will also say that in a world where the Russians and the Chinese and other powers are playing the games that they're playing, others, including our African friends, might come to miss a Europe that is a source of economic attraction, that is a single market, and that has a single regulatory space, and which is actually in a competition with China that, in, you know, while it's not taking place kinetically now, is taking place in terms of economic competition and regulatory competition every damn day, right? We're actually a significant source of power leverage to our American partners, right? There is a reason why the Chinese are trying to split us, right? It's because of that. And I do think that the Europeans sort of being able to stand up both to Russia and to China in terms of what they're trying to do and achieve in Europe might be of interest well beyond our borders. Just put that out there.
You know, Mike Tyson said once famously that everyone has a plan until I hit them on the face. Europe has been hit on the face. And you get to win.
But Martin, we've also reacted, haven't we? Right? We've done things that we've never thought we'd do.
So this is not criticism. I'm saying we're going to. It's how you respond that determines your strength and your ability to keep going. And I think part of what I've heard throughout this conversation, there are going to be a lot of punches to the faces for some years to come now. And a lot of alliances, a lot of partnerships that seemed very stable, that seemed very protective, are going to be called into question. And so I think a lot more countries are going to have to figure out not how to get away from your partners or your allies, but to figure out, okay, if I do get disappointed, if I do get endangered, and there's no reaction from who I consider to be one of my primary partners and allies, what do I do? So there's going to need to be a lot of maneuvering and thinking and strategizing about how to survive the punch. You don't know necessarily where it'll come from and when, but we're entering that kind of period, I think.
Well, thank you very much. We're at time. I don't know if next Tuesday is a punch or not. I suppose it depends on where you sit. In any case, but it will certainly give us a little bit more clarity as to where things are headed. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you for the to the Recenter for organizing this. We really appreciate it, and thank you for those who attended and listened. Thanks very much.
Thank you all. This is fun. Good to see you all.